Hello everyone. Today's lesson is going to be on writing the literary analysis. That can be a paragraph, that could be a full essay, but oftentimes, sorry if you just heard my fireplace kick on, but oftentimes you are going to be asked to respond to literature frequently. Very, very, very frequently. And this is how you're going to go about doing it every single time, and it's called a literary response. If you had me this fall, again, we covered this briefly, but not nearly enough to make sure that everybody's really on the same page with how this should look. And in a lot of ways, it's a little bit formulaic, a little bit scripted in what you need to include at the very least. So I want to talk to you about how you get started on it. I think the name itself sounds scarier than it needs to be. So we're going to break it down, and I have a method that I think will really help you moving forward, as well as a graphic organizer that I think will make it pretty foolproof for you for your assignment today. So the literary analysis, let's talk about, first of all, what you'll be able to do after you watch this. You'll be able to create an effective and quality literary analysis, and you'll be able to assess the quality of what a literary analysis should look like. So you'll have a good idea of what you're going to be doing. Okay, so I use the ISEE method for creating a literary analysis, and there's a couple of different acronyms out there. I really like this one because it's pretty straightforward. So basically you're going to be making an inference, I. Oftentimes in this class you'll be responding to a specific question, and that's your I, right? When I read The Mending Wall by Robert Frost, I'm going to respond directly to the question Miss Brown asks, which is, what is Frost implying when he says his neighbor moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees? What might light and darkness represent or symbolize within this poem? Your I is going to quite literally be your answer. Okay, it's going to be your inference or your idea about the light and darkness within those phrases or lines of poetry. Okay, then the summary is going to be basically where you're kind of summarizing in, one sentence, maybe half a sentence, maybe two sentences, really what the poem is about to give reference or background to the reader of your literary analysis question. The evidence, remember we talked on Monday about citing evidence. This is one of those places you always have to cite evidence. You have to pull a quote from the text. In this case, I use a quote in the question, and I'd really like you to find different evidence, not pulling evidence from the quote I provided from you or for you in the question. If there's nothing else, at the very least, you are including that piece of evidence, okay? And then finally, your explanation is going to be where you as the author talk about reading this poem. And that's going to be the most important part. And we'll talk about the conclusion statement as well. So what does that all look like? Okay. So step one, making an inference. Sometimes I'm just going to say to you, write a literary analysis response. That's going to be a time where you have to come up with it. Like, what am I going to talk about? Am I going to talk about the tone? Am I going to talk about, the characters, the plot? That's where you're going to have a lot of openness. And I think that's even a little bit more challenging because, like, well, what am I going to talk about? I mean, you get to college, that's really what your English classes will do. They'll just say, hey, write an essay about this poem. And that's it. And so that's when you're going to have to try to say, okay, well, what do I infer? What do I think about this poem? And come up with your own inference. For now, you're just responding to the question that I give you, okay? So some things that you can talk about, if you're given kind of an open literary analysis, you can talk about the plot, the setting, point of view, characterization, symbols, which is actually what we're doing today. That's the assignment today. Metaphor, genre, irony, or ambiguity within the text. You can talk about how various components of a piece relate to each other. For example, maybe the beginning of the poem to the end of the poem, or the repetition used within the poem, because there is some in this poem. How to separate, or how two separate literary works deal with the same concept. So for example, if there was another poem that talks about a wall, I think it's kind of funny that we're talking about building a wall. Not funny. Okay. But maybe you could reference that, or maybe you could even talk about some nonfiction about really current events with building a wall compared to this poem that Robert Frost wrote in 1914 about a wall. And that would be a really cool literary analysis piece. And then you could talk about how concepts and forms in literary works relate to, political, social, economic, or religious contexts. And that kind of relates to that topic I just mentioned before. In fact, that would be a really cool literary analysis response question. So step two, summarize what is happening at this point in the novel and introduce your quote. And so basically it's kind of a one sentence thing to get your reader to the point of understanding what your quote's going to be. And it's almost like a way to introduce your quote. Remember, there's no lonely quotes. You don't leave them alone in a paragraph. You don't just plop them in, right? Start with your own words, and this will help you do that, okay? Finally, evidence, right? Including a quote from the text that helps to support whatever your answer is. So whatever your inference is, you got to find something to support it from the text itself. And I put here don't orphan your quote, and I should change that to don't leave a lonely quote. I don't like that word anymore, so I should definitely be changing that. I will change that. But make sure that you use words before and after your quote, okay? And then finally, the explanation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the explanation here in just a moment. But something else to consider, if you're writing a longer piece, if you're writing multiple paragraphs, or you just have multiple pieces of evidence that really support your thought, please use them. Please, it makes your essay stronger. It makes your literary analysis response stronger. And so what this point is to hear is that the EE can repeat. So you could have inference, summary, evidence, explanation, evidence, explanation, evidence, explanation, and you could create a really quality, lengthy response. And when you get to college, that's really what it will look like for you, and I'll show you what I mean. So in your explanation, defend the inference you created in the topic sentence, explain how that piece of evidence supports your thinking, and integrate your evidence and explanation really seamlessly. So they should kind of flow together as much as possible, okay? This is the graphic organizer that you are going to be given. It's actually included right on the place where you're going to write your response. So page 2 of your response is this graphic organizer. I really recommend you use it. A lot of people last fall chose not to, and their essays or their responses really suffered for it, and a lot of points were lost, I think, needlessly. So please, at the very least, use this as a guide, even if you don't fill in the boxes. But my recommendation to you is that you do actually fill in this chart. And then when you're done, it's just as simple as copying your words from here and placing it into a paragraph, because they will literally flow together, right? You start with your inference, your summary, your evidence, your explanation. If you want to add more, you're welcome to, and then you just copy and paste from here, and you have a perfectly beautiful flowing paragraph. So it's something to consider using as you draft this literary analysis response, okay? So I want to show you a couple of examples, and we're not going to use the rubric to assess, but I want you to be thinking about the quality of the response here. Is it good? Is it as best as it could be? And I'm going to show you kind of a poor example, kind of a middle of the road example, and then a really exceptional example. And what I'll tell you is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I read this in college, and this is actually my responses. I've taken out pieces for the poorer examples, but just this last year, was it 2 years ago? Doesn't matter. I went back to school to worked on my doctorate in education, and so this is one of the classes that I took and one of the responses that I created. This first one here is a poor example, so let's take a look at it together. Dr. Jekyll was motivated by his desire to separate his core self from the dark and evil self that resided within his soul. He was conflicted by his moral values within a rigid Victorian religious culture. In an attempt to maintain his high social status and reputation, he wished to create a separate identity entirely to live out the darker side of his personality, the behaviors and desires deemed inappropriate by Victorian standards. Initially, Dr. Jekyll had control over his dark alter ego, but as the evil grew in strength, Dr. Jekyll lost the battle for control. What works here? What does work? Well, I do have an inference statement. Okay, I'm telling you that these are the motivations. So I'm speaking to a part of literature, right? A character motivation. So I have a decent inference here of what was his motivation. Okay. I do go ahead and explain a little bit about his motivation, maybe why he created a darker, evil side of himself. But a couple things that are missing, right? I don't have any evidence from the text. None. There's no quotes here that help prove my point. And in a lot of ways, this is really just a summary, right? It's kind of a summary of the story. And anybody who's read the story can be like, yeah, I knew that, right? What am I adding as an author here? What are my thoughts adding? Really nothing at this point. So that would make this probably not a very good example of a literary response. Okay. So this would be kind of the middle of the road example, and this is from The Importance of Being Earnest. And I think it's okay that you have not read this. I just want you to look a little bit at my response here. So in this, I'm making my inference here in the first sentence. Men and women face their own unique issues with oppression during Victorian times. Women had gained very few rights, and they were still expected to be meek, virtuous, innocent, weak, ignorant, beautiful, and subservient. This is a quote. It's actually not a quote from the actual story itself. It's a quote from some research that I had done. So within this kind of middle of the road response here, I have done some research, and I've also later included a quote from the text. And that's what makes this stronger. In your responses, I'm outside of your research assignment at the end of the year here, I'm not expecting you to do find multiple sources. You can simply quote from our story, and that is sufficient, okay? But I go on to then explain it. So I'm talking about how men and women have different expectations of them in Victorian times, right? With this hundreds of years ago. Although sadly maybe some of that still continues. But when women felt or acted outside of these established norms and acceptable traits, they divided themselves from the desire to be accepted in society to fighting this gender oppression. For self-survival, women had no choice but to use marriage as a social tool, providing financial security that they could not receive on their own. The female characters in Wilde's play. So now I'm finally kind of getting to the actual play or story here, portray this exchange for social status and the frivolity of the expected female disposition. Lady Bracknell makes it her personal mission to ensure that both Algernon and Gwendolen characters marry with good social standing. After Jack's proposals, she interrogates him to determine his ability to maintain Gwendolen's social order. After discovering he lives on the unfashionable side, here's my quote from the text, and this is an example of peppering the quote, right? I just included a couple words. Has no apparent family lineage, he's deemed unacceptable. Gwendolen and Cicely demonstrate the vacuous way of life Victorian women maintained in their silly fascination with the name Ernest, as if no other character trait would be better determinant of a quality marriage material. So not understanding the story, basically, in that final sentence, I'm finally kind of hitting home on my inference. And so I'm just going to tell you that that's the case. Things that I think are missing here is a lot of this is explanation on the times as opposed to really hitting home the my own analysis of Wilde's play. I think too much of this is not about the actual play itself. And the other piece I think that is missing is, yes, it's great to pepper a quote, but I feel like more evidence from the play itself would have been better. Okay. And then finally, this is a quality example and of what and probably more of a college submission. So maybe this could be really overwhelming for you too, and I don't want you to feel like it needs to be exactly like this. Not to mention I use very, very big words and that I'm not expecting from you, and that's okay. But one thing, and I'm not actually going to read this, one thing I want to point out that I do differently within this is in the very first sentence, I'm including the title and the author, which I think is really good. In this case, my inference is going to be about the tone of this piece, and I state it really directly here. So I have my clear inference here. Okay, then the rest of this paragraph is actually directly relating to the story itself. And I include multiple pieces of evidence from and this is actually a poem, The Wasteland, from the poem itself. And actually there's 3 pieces of evidence here that really explain, and then within that I explain those pieces of evidence very clearly. So I will put this example on our assignment page for today if you want to take a closer look at this or read fully through what this might look like, to give you the opportunity to do so. But I think one thing that I want you to take away from this is, one, including multiple pieces of evidence is awesome if you can do it, but make sure that you do include at least one piece of evidence in your literary responses. Make sure your explanation is thorough. I've always said to my students that it is a weak writer that uses multiple lines or multiple sentences of evidence and only a couple of their own. And really what this should be is mostly your own thoughts. Your evidence should be small in comparison to everything that you have to say about the story or the poem, okay? So that's something else to keep in mind, okay? And then finally is looking at how to cite poetry. We didn't really talk about this in Monday's lesson. And so one thing that's going to be different, when you have a line of poetry and it ends and then it goes to the next line, this symbol here is how you represent that that is a new line of poetry following this, okay? And then finally, in this case, this poem actually was within a large anthology for my class, but generally you'll actually put the lines of poetry here so that the reader could go quickly see this poem and see the lines of the poem and find your evidence. Okay, so you would just put Eliot 41 through 42. Okay, so something else to kind of think about.